Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video we're going to attempt to make sprites in the style of Chrono Trigger, which to me is one of the best and best looking 16-bit RPGs that there is. I've got a few characters that I'd like to recreate in this style, and you can probably already guess who these are going to be. But before that, we should just try to figure out what the main ingredients are that go into the look of a Chrono Trigger sprite. So let's pull up the sprites from the main cast here, just in their neutral standing poses. We can see that they're all around 32 pixels tall. Frog is only 24 pixels, obviously distinctly meant to be a shorter character. But I guess the takeaway here is just that the 32 pixel mark, that's sort of the average or the default to start from when you're just thinking about, your basic non-frog human design. Now, the overall height is only one piece of the equation though, because you could decide on a certain height for your character, like 32 pixels, but that's not necessarily indicative of any particular style on its own. And one thing that really affects the style is the way that that character is proportioned into that space. To demonstrate what I mean, we can break down these characters into a few basic shapes, and we can do that by tracing out circles over the head and the hands and the feet, and just trying to ignore things like the hairstyles and the costuming for now, and we'll end up with these sort of blank skeletons that are kind of underneath all of that decoration. So if there's anything characteristic about the Chrono Trigger sprites as opposed to the other styles here, one of the things that stands out to me is how the Chrono sprite has a smaller head-to-body ratio than a lot of the other sprite styles here. It's more toward a realistically proportioned human, and that's not to say that it's accurate in that sense. It's very much still in a kind of hyper-stylized proportion. It's just that it's less chibi or less deformed compared to some of these other sprites here. Probably the strongest example of that is if you look at the sprite of Omori. You've got a big head, big bubbly head that actually kind of takes up more space than the body does. Whereas if we look at Chrono, smaller head, more room accounted for the body. So the trade-off is that there's less space to work with for things like facial features, I guess, but more space allocated to costuming details and maybe posing of the limbs and that sort of thing. What's cool is that if you continue breaking down the other Chrono Trigger sprites in the same way, you can find essentially this same skeleton repeating itself across the roster, just in different poses. Well, again, for the basic human designs at least. But it is also fun to see the proportioning on other types of builds, like with Robo. So I think what we can gain from this is that when we go to build our own Chrono Trigger style sprites, we can use these sort of formulaic building blocks and pieces, these sort of stick figure mannequins or whatever, to pose around, and we'll end up with something that has approximately the right size and proportion to it. Now, the other component of studying this style is going to be the use of color. From a design standpoint, each character really has their own strong color themes going on. Chrono's got the teal and orange thing going on. Frog's got green and blue as his main colors. So as a cast, each one fills a nice little pocket of color selection. What I also noticed when analyzing these sprites from the pixel art perspective is that most of them here have a palette of exactly 12 colors that are used. All of them except for Ayla, who has 13, and Frog, who's got 11. Apparently there's a limit of 16 colors per sprite on the Super Nintendo, so these are just under that limit, which is totally fine. It's just interesting to see that, I guess from an artistic standpoint, there is this consistency of about a 12 color palette that's going on here. So let's try to make our own Chrono Trigger characters, and I'm going to be remaking some Final Fantasy VII characters in the Chrono Trigger style, starting with Cloud, and I've just got his character art there off to the side to use as a reference for what we'll be translating, obviously. We'll grab that skeleton framework that was derived from the Chrono sprite and start connecting it up to give us a basic outline for the body, starting with the arms and sort of taking the outer track around those plotted points of the shoulder and elbow and having that meet up with the hand. For the boots, I noticed that Chrono Trigger sprites often use a prominent cuff, so we'll put in some line work to shape that cuff around the foot. In between the line work, I've used this structure where it's 3 pixels in a row, and then the next one is a single pixel up from that, which I think helps to show it sort of rounding around the leg, right? And with that in place, this only leaves a bit of space to connect up the rest of the legs. And in doing that, I'm trying to capture the sort of poofiness or the angled silhouette of the pants. And to help that, I'm going to use some of the black line work as a shadow on the lower part of the leg, and that should help to show a bit of that volume. The final prominent features here on the body are the pauldron and the harness that's over the chest, and those should be easier to define once we get to the coloring stage, but for now I'm just using the line work and the space available to kind of block those in. Now, moving on to the hair, I'm gonna try to do what looks to be what was the approach for the Chrono Sprite, which is basically to assemble the hair out of a sort of mosaic of smaller shapes. These are both your typical spiky-haired protagonists, so what I'm trying to do here is use mostly like rigid triangle shapes and fit them together into a similar, geometry or whatever as the reference art has. This is also where it's nice to have started from that blank head underneath everything, because you're really able to visualize like where the skull is underneath this and kind of build this framework of hair on top of it and giving it that appropriate volume that sits away from the head. All right, let's start adding some color here. And we can do a first pass of just dropping solid colors inside the lines. And this first wave of colors is going to be kind of the mid-tone shades, which means it's just like the base color for that part of the costume. And we'll come back around with a second wave of colors to add either a shadow or a highlight or both on top of this and get more of that detailed and polished look. So because we're going to be working with only 12 colors, we do have a fair bit of freedom to a degree, but there's always opportunities to try and be economical with the exact color choices and overlaps. That being said, in our sampling of sprites from Chrono Trigger, I found it was generally the case that the skin used two colors. There's sort of the base tone and then a shade tone for it. And for the most part, these two skin shades were only used for the skin. Like, they didn't really show up that much on other parts of the costuming that weren't meant to be skin. And for the hair, it's pretty common to step through 3 or 4 colors, depending on how you want to count what belongs to the hair. For Cloud, I've stepped through yellow and orange, and then there's like a dark red or brown that's used to color the line work within the hair. And I've even used that same outline color to go around the face as some colored line work that's like at the edge of the skin there. By the time we're done rendering, the approach is going to be that we'll have colored over a fair bit of that original black line work using these different darker tones that suit that particular bit of costuming. And I think this is part of the formula as to why these sprites look so rich and colorful, is that instead of black line work, you've got this subtle colored line work that's going throughout the entire sprite, and it just punches up the vibrancy in a nice way. This also means, though, that it's something to budget out when thinking ahead to the set of 12 colors that are going to be used for that palette. As a final touch, I'm going to add Cloud's Buster Sword onto his back. I feel like that'll really properly make this feel like it's Cloud, even within this Chrono Trigger look. So I'm sketching this out on a separate layer just to know what kind of area it's going to take up, and then just popping that back in behind the sprite. For the finalized sprite work, I made a slight adjustment to the colors here that I'd been working with. The original palette were all colors that I had sourced from various Chrono Trigger sprites, and I took those and just kind of dialed them into my own selection. So I feel like that came out looking pretty good. I mean, he's essentially a rehash of the way that original Chrono sprite looks, but it was a nice safe one to start with and just kind of get our bearings on what the style entails. Next up, though, I want to recreate Tifa in this pose that she's in from the artwork. So I'm going to start by getting those building blocks into place again, approximately in a way that looks like it's this pose. For this sprite, I'm also going to do it where one foot is more forward than the other. We see this on a few of the other sprites, so it'd be nice to kind of break things up and try this posture this time around. Now, with Tifa, the focus for the line work is going to be to find clarity in the arms and the legs. And the way that I'm going to do that is by making sure to leave at least a 1 pixel channel between the line work that we can go in later and drop color into. We want to have the ability to follow that line of pixels that create the limbs so that this pose can read properly. One of the speed bumps that I'm running into here, though, is that there's not really a lot of space left over for the legs after carving out space for the tank top and the skirt. So I'm going to raise the entire sprite up by 1 pixel, which sounds like such a minor thing, but it actually gives like the exact amount of breathing room that you need to kind of make those adjustments sometimes. With the coloring, one of the things I'm prioritizing here is putting in these bright highlights for the gloves and the boots. Her attacks are mostly martial arts focused, so it makes sense to draw attention to these spots on the sprite and using such a strong color ramp like that. To finalize the sprite, I'm going through to add the colored line work. And Tifa has sort of a simpler color scheme than Cloud did, so this is a bit more relaxed, just finding that space for everything within the palette of 12. I wanted to dig in on a few of the choices that were made here that I think help add to the capturing the rendering style of Chrono Trigger. Firstly, I mentioned the white highlights in sort of the highly reflective or areas of interest. bright highlights like this sometimes also appear on the skin as well. So for Tifa, I've done a single dot at the shoulder and another at the knee. Another thing that's going on here is like fitting in smaller details. Like I've used the gray shades at her elbow and wrist to suggest the pads and sleeves that she's got. And normally when a detail is this small or there's not really a lot of room to account for it, I might consider losing that altogether. But it feels like with the Chrono Trigger sprites, they really go for this sort of thing. Like having all those little details of wristbands, hair ties, any kind of belts or straps. Even if it's only like 2 or 3 pixels and it's the difference of only a subtle shade of color, maybe just try to make it work and go for it. And then you end up with this interesting level of detail going on within the sprite. And there's some actual intention there because we know how it relates back to the character design. All right, the final character is going to be Barret. Given the size difference here compared to the other characters, I think he's going to make a good one for testing out this workflow under kind of extreme conditions. So I'm starting with those same idea of the building blocks just like before, but this time we'll make the circles a little bit larger just to account for his exaggerated build. In connecting up the line work and starting to find the structure here, I'm mainly focusing on adapting that core area of like the ripped jacket, vest, and trying to give clarity to the musculature, but also having room to create a few of the tatters on the vest. There's also a fair amount of layering or costume blocking to think about here for Barret. Like he's got the metal bands over his stomach. There's also a dog tag and chain there if we want to try and catch that detail. So just to give even more breathing room for all of that that's going on, I'm going to push the size a little bit taller here. The original intent for this was to maybe keep him at 32 pixels, but pushing him up to 36 should actually just give an appropriate height to have him like towering above the other characters anyway. With the color selection, I'm very quickly running up to that max of 12 just because there's a few distinct gradients to try to capture here. We've got the skin tones, there's a selection of greens for the pants, the colors on the vest, and then there's the blue-grays of all the gunmetal parts, plus the line work that's going to be associated with those. So I'm looking for a few efficiencies here, things that can overlap in their color use. So in this case, I've ended up reusing some of the darker browns throughout the skin and the boots, and that brown, or one of them, also gets used as the colored line work within the vest. I also kind of went all out with the highlights here. Hopefully you've got an eye to spot those now, but I've dropped in some white pixels along the tatters of the vest just to give it more dimensionality. And then there's of course some metallic shine on the gun hand. But let's look at that full crew together. And we'll of course bring in the rest of that Chrono Trigger cast just to see how everybody fits all together. And for a first attempt, I feel like these came out looking decently authentic. I really tried to figure out, what the formula was here. And I think I could at least imagine these Final Fantasy VII characters in like the future part of Chrono Trigger. But we'll close out with some CRT time to look at these in their natural environment. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.